Well, we're into the second Sunday in Lent, and we have 3 readings that are beautifully related. In the first reading from Genesis, Abraham walks up towards a height that God will point out to him to carry out God's command to offer his son Isaac as a holocaust on an altar of fire. We know that God sends a messenger to prevent that action, and Abraham discovered his unfaltering obedience would bring countless blessings down through the ages. In the second reading to Romans, Paul writes that Jesus was to be handed over and to suffer and die. There is no intervening angel here. Only after the suffering will the Son be raised from death to sit in glory at God's right hand. There, the Son Jesus will intercede for us. This year, the gospel account of Jesus' transfiguration is from St. Mark. Matthew, Mark, and Luke each write of the transfiguration, and each places the transfiguration right after the first prediction of Jesus' passion. Mark's account is a short, tight 8 verses. He gives few details, just the essence. The narrative moves quickly, or as Mark prefers, immediately, from one point to another. Mark uses the word immediately 41 times in his gospel. He lays a foundation for the transfiguration immediately before in chapter 8, where Jesus asked his disciples who people say he is. He warned the disciples then that he would be rejected by the religious leaders and he would suffer and be killed. But after 3 days, he would rise from the grave. Jesus then sternly commanded the disciples to tell no one about him. The disciples didn't get all that talk on being put to death, and Peter typically spoke up to rebuke Jesus and was quickly reprimanded by him. Chapter 9 begins with 6 days after this prediction of the Passion. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, his 3 closest companions, to a high mountain. Immediately, Jesus' appearance is transfigured. His garments become gleaming white, whiter than any bleacher could match. Here on the mountain, the traditional place of divine revelation, the disciples are given a glimpse of Jesus' glory. Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, the great prophet, appear on the scene conversing with Jesus. Recall, Elijah vanished out of sight, but was to return at some undesignated future time. Jesus would die and rise after 3 days in the tomb. So now, Jesus is the perfect fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. Immediately, Peter reacts to this presence and says, "It is good for us to be here." He wants to prolong this tremendous experience, to memorialize it by setting up 3 tents, one for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Down through their history, the Israelites set up tents as the dwelling place for the divine. Mark immediately transitions into the clouds overshadowing them all. The cloud, another sign of the divine presence. Unable to see, the disciples hear the voice, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." The disciples had heard this same voice at Jesus' baptism. God said, "This is my beloved Son." It is reiterated here, Jesus is my beloved Son. The disciples were to listen to him. Listen, an imperative. Remember, on another mountain, that of Calvary, Jesus' identity as Son was affirmed by the Roman centurion who proclaimed, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Abruptly, immediately, the disciples now see only Jesus. How long could they be in the presence of the divine? They begin descending the mountain. Jesus commands them once again to say nothing to anyone until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Imagine the disciples have just been immersed in this extraordinary experience, and now they listen to Jesus speaking about his rising from his death. Big contrast and a big problem for the disciples. Being Orthodox Jews, they believed in the resurrection at the end of time. How they ponder, is Jesus going to rise before them? They hadn't understood the early suffering and crucifixion prediction, and they don't understand now that Jesus would rise from the dead. As they leave the mountains, the disciples ask themselves, in light of what they have just witnessed, what does rising from the dead mean? That's a good question for us. What does rising from the dead mean for us? St. Paul gives us insight into that as he writes to the Philippians. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, emptied himself. Being born in human likeness, he became obedient to the point of death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him so that every knee should bend and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. In the midst of the world pandemic, in the throes of our country's millions of deaths and political disarray, in the dying of many friends, family, and community members, what does rising from the dead mean for us? A poignant question. During our Lenten journey, we will be helped in responding by attentively, humbly listening to Jesus, the beloved Son.